Hey guys, the Kamsh here. Today we'll be talking about a deck I've been brewing with a little bit, and that's Astral Communion Druid. So the goal of the deck is to innervate, coin, or wild growth into Astral Communion. So you discard your hand, but you gain 10 mana crystals, and then basically almost everything else in the deck is there so that it can draw you more cards and refill your hand, or it's just a game-ending threat that you'll be playing so early that your opponent shouldn't have an answer to it. So let's go through all the cards in the deck, how good they are after Astral Communion or before it, and so on and so forth. And one of the real strengths of the deck is that even if you don't draw Astral Communion, although you do mulligan for it every hand, which makes the mulligan guide a little bit simpler this time around, one of the strengths of the deck is that even without it, it can function as a standard ramp druid deck. So we have 2 Innervate. This is definitely your worst draw. It's almost the only bad draw after Astral Communion, but hopefully you're innervating Astral Communion, so that's not a thing that happens. You also mulligan for this card and Astral Communion. Those are usually the only 2 cards you mulligan for in the deck. And it's just a very solid card that accelerates things, and it's definitely one of your best draws if you're not going the Communion route. We have 2 Wild Growth, which also accelerates you into Communion off coin. It's a little bit awkward on coin, because if you coin Wild Growth, that's the same thing as just coining Astral Communion a turn later, and if you just Wild Growth, then you have the 4 mana before you get a chance to Communion. So Wild Growth doesn't really accelerate you to Communion on coin, but if you draw it after Astral Communion, you can cycle it, because you already have 10 mana crystals, so you'll get excess mana, and you can draw a card. It also works great with Chromagus. Moving on, we have Wrath, which is just a removal spell that we can draw later on. Again, it helps the deck function before Communion, and it's also fine after, because you can, if there's a creature on the board, you can deal 1 damage to a minion and draw a card, and then draw into like an 8-drop and cast it, or Doctor Boom or something, since you have 10 mana. And if there are no creatures on the board, you're probably doing fine anyway, since you have 10 mana, and your opponent probably does not. Very, very likely does not, unless you're playing the Mirror if this deck somehow becomes popular. But I doubt that, because it's a little bit weird to play. But we'll get into that later. So we have 2 Astral Communion, key card in the deck. We already talked about this. Pretty sweet. It's important to note that if you Astral Communion, then you draw another Communion, you can cast it again, and it'll give you excess mana as well. So this, it's not great because it's 4 mana to draw a card, but you can draw one of the 5 or 6 drops that you'll be able to cast. So drawing Communion after Communion isn't the worst thing ever. We have 2 Swipe and 2 Keeper. These are probably the second worst draw after Innervate once you Communion, but they're necessary evils. They're good removal spells, and this is a good silence against like Freeze Mage. And basically they're very versatile utility cards that you want to have in the deck, especially if you're not going this route. And even at worst, if you draw this after a Communion, you can, deal with your opponent's board and then draw something bigger. So you definitely want to be playing both of these. We have 2 Nourish. It's great if you're going just the ramp route, because you can get to the 2 mana crystals, or you get to draw 3 cards after Communion, which is great because you usually draw into like another 5-drop that you can also cast, and then some more gas for the late game. We have 2 Azure Drakes just because it's a 4/4. It works great with Swipe and Wrath, and it draws you a card when you play it, which is really important since you can chain 5 drops after you Communion. 2 Druid of the Claw, just versatile, both charge and taunt, just a good solid minion. 1 Harrison, because against the weapon decks, which, Paladin and Patron Warrior are pretty rampant right now, so this also draws you cards after you Communion, so it's a little bit like Azure Drake in that way. Also a decent body, not the worst card even if your opponent doesn't have weapons. We have 1 Loatheb, just because it stops our opponent from doing whatever they're going to be doing going off if they're playing some sort of combo deck, and just a good card, can help lock our opponent out, especially if we play 2 5-drops and our opponent can't cast a removal spell that turn because we Loatheb, then we very easily close out the game. We have 1 Belcher, because we want a few more taunts just in case, since we're kind of dirtling around and communing in the early game. If our opponent's playing an aggressive deck, we want to have enough taunts to survive. We have 1 Emperor Thorison. This card's great because once you actually go off after Communion, you start nourishing and drawing lots of cards. You do have a lot of cards in your hand, and even though you have 10 mana, you can't actually cast all of them. Helps reduce the cost. It's just great. Casting it early is good. Sometimes it's a little bit awkward since you have very few cards in your hand, but it's still a 6 mana 5/5, which isn't awful when you're casting it super early, and it's definitely one of the best cards if you're not going the Communion route. Sylvanas, just to steal our opponent's threats, just a solid mid-range minion, very powerful. 2 Ancient of Lore, super important in this deck because they do draw you cards. They also restore health against the aggro deck. Both are effects you really want. I think you'd play like 10 of these if you could, but just very, very good, very versatile. And then we get into our really late game threats. We have Doctor Boom, very strong. One important thing to note about Thorison as well is if we Chromagus a Thorison, it's a very powerful effect. You just gotta dump your hand. I've gotten there with this deck, and it's really fun. Anyway, so Dr. Boom, just another really good threat. On the similar note, because Dr. Boom and BGH kind of go hand in hand, we're not playing BGH because our plan is to overwhelm our opponent with our threats, and because BGH would be a really bad top deck after Communion. But moving on, Well, we have the Doctor Boom as a very good threat. You know, if you play this on like turn 3 or something, there's no way the opponent wins most of the time. We have a Chromagus just because we do have a lot of draw effects in this deck, and once we Communion, this is one of our best draws. We can Chromagus and draw a bunch of cards and draw even more cards from the drawing cards and just refill our hand after the Communion, which is great. We have Cenarius just because it makes a lot of creatures and builds a very solid board after a Communion. We have Nefarian because not only is it a body after you Communion, it also basically draws you 2 cards, so you have something to do with your mana, even if your future draws aren't great. And Ysera fulfills a similar purpose because we want to be drawing lots of cards. So a couple of things to note: we're not playing combo because it's not, you know, it's not great to draw Savage Roar or Force after we Communion, especially since our opponent most of the time won't have that big of a board by then, and we don't have enough card draw to consistently get there. We're not playing some other game-ending threats like Deathwing. Deathwing, obviously, because we'd have to discard even more cards, and it's just a 12-12. And Alex, although it could kill them quickly, can pressure. Most of the time, they'll get BGH or something. We want big ending threats that actually build up card advantage or our board more. So that's why we're not playing those. One final thing to note: it's easy to forget to you just Communion pass your turn because you have no cards in hand. When you Communion, you can Hero Power immediately because it gives you the 10 mana crystals, so you can always Hero Power their face. So that's the deck. Definitely check out the Mulligan guide on TempoStorm.com, although again, pretty simple. You usually want to go for Innervate, Wild Growth, Off Coin, and Communion, but there's also other great stuff like matchup guides, so on and so forth. And then also definitely check out some of the games we're going to play. So thank you for watching, and come watch us as we jump into some games.